all you lovely valid people, and welcome to Let's Read with Final Fantasy XIV. So grab some tea, maybe a dessert, and a nice mammal of sorts, and let's all sit down and enjoy. Now, we are going to start off with Pride and Prejudice. One, because it's in the public domain, and it makes it so much easier for me to avoid YouTube monetization. And two, because this book gets a weird rep. And by weird, I mean some people think it's useless chick lit, and some people think it's a challenging, boring read. Which it is not, but in case you have trouble reading, I am here to help you with Final Fantasy XIV, because I have to combine the two. So, we're going to start off with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Now, couple things of note. Jane Austen actually majorly changed the writing scene during this time. Before Jane Austen, women in novels and media were portrayed as these sweet, innocent, lovely little creatures whose virtue and vitality needed to be protected at all costs from the harsh realities of the world, which makes me want to throw up and stab myself with a fork. Yeah, women were not seen as creatures or humans with intellect and wit who were able to have thoughts that were above virtue or whatever. So when Jane Austen came around, one, she changed the way we write characters forever, and two, she finally, brought to the surface a whole world of woman writing for women and other people, and showing that, women, characters that were women that did have thoughts and feelings and actually, voiced their concerns and had a valid point. And that was new. And she did it in a very satirical way that was very endearing to the public. And that's part of the reason she rose to fame. The other reason, and this is something I want to point out here, because if you've ever seen either the TV show or the Keira Knightley movie of Pride and Prejudice, or maybe you watch Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which I don't recommend because that movie sucks. So, if you've ever watched any of those, you'll probably notice something very interesting. And that is that Jane, the eldest sister, is always portrayed as blonde, and Lizzie, the second oldest, is always portrayed as like brunette, redhead, kind of in between. Now, there is no basis in the book for this, because Jane Austen never physically describes her characters, and if she does, it is always extremely vague, meaning that these characters are portrayed this way because somebody did it in media once, and everyone did it there. And this is actually very interesting, because I feel it goes against Jane Austen's original groundbreaking rhetoric, which was that women are more than these virtuous creatures that need to be protected. They have thoughts and valid feelings. And there is a giant stigma on Jane, who is seen as the beautiful sister, being blonde, because it portrays Jane as innocent and the ideal that Jane Austen was fighting against. And I do not appreciate that. Now, there's nothing wrong with being blonde. I'm blonde for half the year, so I get it. The stigma in media, I would like to see Jane and Lizzie with different hairstyles, because Jane Austen never describes how her characters look. Meaning her characters could look any way. At all. The only closest thing we have to a physical description of the Bennet sisters is that the youngest one, Lydia, is taller than the rest. Which also mirrors my life, because my youngest sister is taller than all of us. But it happens, and that is the closest description we get on the Bennet sisters, or actually anyone in this book, really. So, physical description wasn't part of Jane Austen's character writing, but she is so good at personality character writing and in-depth stuff that we feel we know the characters and we know what they look like. We have an image in our heads, and that is the sign of a truly great writer. A truly great writer is one who doesn't need to describe a physical thing to gain audience participation. They can describe what is going on inside and still have the audience totally enraptured in their story. So I just want to get those kinds of things out of the way. Jane Austen completely changed the game in terms of how we view writing and characters, and in terms of how we view women in storytelling and books. And with that, let's move on to chapter 1. Oh, by the way, this will be a 1 to 5 chapters. I'm not doing the whole book. That would be ridiculous. So, chapter 1 to 5, and we're starting off with 1. Yeah, okay. So, in chapter 1, we are introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, who are the parents of the story, and they're dynamic. So, Mrs. Bennet, the Bennets are what we would consider a middle-class family at this time, and Mrs. Bennet is the wife who's trying to get her daughters married. And a new gentleman has moved into town into one of the areas. So they live in the countryside, and one of the estates has been bought by a young man of wealth. Which brings us to the first sentence of the chapter, and probably one of the most quoted things ever, although I feel the quote often gets misused. And that is, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters." This sets the tone for the entire book, and it is also a very satirical take on the way society functioned at the time. At the time, women were basically property, and if you had only daughters, that was a problem because you had to provide a dowry for all of your daughters, and the only way you could gain status was through marriage. So if a wealthy man rolls into town who is single and has a good fortune, all the parents in the neighborhood suddenly want to throw their daughters at him because hopefully they'll be able to advance in life and be able to have a good quality of life. And it also reflects well on the family. Family status is everything. So, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are talking about the new neighbor, Charles Bingley. Now, Charles Bingley, no one knows what he looks like, no one knows who he is, but he has moved into the neighborhood. And Mrs. Bingley, having 5 daughters and not a lot of income, wants her husband to go visit Mrs. Bennet. Having 5 daughters, not a lot of income, wants her husband to go visit Mr. Bingley. And this sets the scene because Mrs. Bennet's like, "Hey, you should go visit this new wealthy guy." And Mr. Bennet's like, "I don't want to do that." And Mrs. Bingley's like, or Mrs. Bennet is like, "I think you should go do that because it would be really good for our daughters to be married to him." And Mr. Bennet is like, I don't want to do that. So here's the thing. In this time, the only way you could actually be properly introduced to someone was if the head of your household went and made the introductions first. If a new neighbor came in and you saw them on the street, you couldn't just say hi. You had to actually go up and have a proper introduction or a proper mode of introduction. You had to have someone introduce you, especially someone of status. So Mrs. Bennet is telling her husband, "Hey, please go introduce us to the new guy so that we can have a proper introduction before the dance the next night where he's going to be so I can throw my daughters at him." And Mr. Bennet is like, "I don't want to do that. That sounds annoying." Now, here's the thing. During this conversation, Mr. Bennet's like, "Why don't you go say hi?" And Miss Bennet's like, "That would be vastly improper, but I thank you for the flattery." And you really see in this conversation, they talk about their daughters a bit, and you really see whose preference is which. So the Bennets have 5 daughters and no sons, which is kind of an issue, as I stated before. And their daughters are Jane, the eldest, who is the reputable beauty. She's very beautiful and very kind. And then you have Lizzie, the second oldest, who's more of a witty, playful kind of person. Then you have Mary. Mary is very into her studies, and she's very astute and academic. Mary barely says anything in the book, and some movies even debate cutting her out of the story because she's in it for so little of time. Then you have Kitty. Kitty is kind of naive, a little younger, kind kind of a follower, not so much the rule maker. Then you have Lydia. Lydia is the youngest, and she is the most carefree and tends to rope Kitty into all of her exploits. Lydia and Kitty are known as the flirts of the neighborhood. And during this conversation with between the Bennets, you see the things where Mrs. Bingley, or Miss Bennet, I keep confusing the two B names, Miss Bennet really likes Jane and Lydia, her oldest and her youngest. And the reason she likes them is Jane is beautiful, and Lydia is very lively and reminds Miss Bennet of her when she was younger, a very lively, very flirty child. Mr. Bennet really likes Lizzie because Lizzie is smart and witty. And this right here shows their values within their family. You see their values while they're talking to each other, where you see what they appreciate and what they like. So the conversation basically ends in chapter 1, where Mr. Bennet's saying, I'm not going, and Miss Bennet's like, well, if there were 20 young gentlemen, will you go visit them? And Mr. Bennet's like, if there were 20, I would totally go visit them. Moving on to chapter 2. So, in chapter 2, we get the Bennets coming back, basically. These chapters are very short in the beginning. They get a little longer later on in the book, but we get the Bennets coming back in the beginning. And Mr. Bennet is basically trolling his wife. So Mr. Bennet went and visited Mr. Bingley. He just didn't tell his family. So basically, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are there with their daughters, and one of their daughters is coughing, and Miss Bennet takes out her frustration on her daughter and gets mad at her. And they have a conversation about their neighbors and who will introduce them to Mr. Bingley because their father won't go visit Mr. Bingley. And Mr. Bennet has already visited Mr. Bingley. He just doesn't want to tell his wife because he likes to watch her spin her wheels. So Miss Bennet is freaking out, and then she's finally like, I'm sick of Mr. Bingley. We're never going to talk about him. And Mr. Bennet's like, okay, well, that's a shame because I definitely went and visited him, and we're definitely going to see him again. So, like, too bad. And then Miss Bingley's like, oh, or Miss Bennet, god damn it, I keep doing that. Miss Bennet's like, I am so happy you guys have such a great father. And this is kind of just how they communicate. And it really shows the family dynamic, because if this is how the heads of the household communicate, you can kind of see how the daughters are going to function, which is maybe not super well. But, I mean, by the standards of the time, this was probably not the worst. So that's pretty much all of chapter 2. They focus on the upcoming dance. And in chapter 3, we finally are introduced to the Lucases. And, well, not super introduced, but the Lucases are the Bennets' next door neighbors. And they're very good friends. They've known each other all their lives. And Miss Lucas and Miss Bennet are very good friends, and they gossip a lot. So the Miss Lucas and Miss Bennet, though, they're kind of like frenemies. They like to get under each other's skin a lot of the time. So, as frenemies do, Miss Bennet is freaking out about Bingley going away right before the dance and planning to bring back a party. So Miss Lucas spreads a rumor that Bingley's going to come back with thousands of girls and it's going to be a horrible thing and all of this. And Miss Bennet starts freaking out. But then it's revealed that no, Bingley is coming back with his sisters and his brother-in-law and a friend. So that's basically what happens. So then they go to the dance, and this is kind of a community event. This ball is kind of a community event. The entire community gets together. They have a huge dance. They have fun, whatever. So at the dance, Bingley is there, and he introduces his friend, Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy is extremely wealthy, which, as stated in the first chapter, in the first verse that I read, if you are wealthy, the mothers would want to throw their daughters at you. However, Darcy is also extremely not happy to be there, and he makes it very well known. He doesn't talk to anyone. He doesn't socialize with anyone. He rarely looks at anyone. He does not dance with anyone but the two sisters of Bingley that he knows. And he rubs a lot of people the wrong way. Bingley, on the other hand, is having a great time. Bingley loves the dance. He's talking to everyone. He dances with Jane twice, which is extremely flattering, especially in a small dance. To dance twice with the same person is seen as a huge sign of respect. And, as such, Bingley is seen very well, but Darcy is immediately seen as off. And Miss Bennet personally doesn't like Darcy because he slighted Lizzie. So during this dance, there are a lot of ladies and gentlemen and stuff, but there's a distinct lack of, there's more ladies than there are gentlemen. So Lizzie decides to sit down and let some of the others have a turn dancing. She's doing something nice. She's letting other people in the group have a turn to, stand up and dance. Bingley is trying to get Darcy to dance, and Bingley's all like, hey, Darcy, go dance. I found a really pretty girl to dance with. How about her sister? Her sister's also really pretty. You could dance with her. And Darcy's just like, you're dancing with the only tolerable girl in the world, or in the room, and I don't want to dance with that girl because she's slighted by other men, and it would be a punishment to stand up with her, and she's not handsome enough for me. And that's a very big insult. So Lizzie doesn't really mind much because she doesn't think Darcy's very fun to be around, and no one does, so she's like, whatever. But Miss Bennet does not like that her other daughter was slighted. So she starts launching kind of a more rumorsome tirade against Darcy. And this is very evident in the book with the public opinion in the area of Hertfordshire and Darcy's opinion. So in chapter 4, Lizzie and Jane are actually on their own, and they're able to talk more openly. So they're a little bit more cagey around their parents, because as you see, their parents have a very interesting dynamic. So Lizzie and Jane are talking, and Jane's like, I really like Bingley, he's super nice. And Lizzie makes a joke that, he's also handsome, which every man should be if he can help it. Basically say, he's not bad to look at either, Jane. Jane is kind of shy, but she does like Bingley, but she doesn't want to show it because she doesn't want to be accused of being just after him for his money. And that's a very big thing. A lot of people in classes, and when they evaluate Pride and Prejudice, they'll call Jane a gold digger because she does go after Bingley. She does really like Bingley. But Jane's actually in the book trying not to be one. She doesn't want to seem improper, because if you were to throw yourself at a gentleman, that would be seen as improper in these times. And Jane wants to make sure that her reputation, her family's reputation, is protected. So she really likes Bingley, but she doesn't want to do anything too big to, show it. And Lizzie gives Jane leave to like him. She says, basically, you've liked stupider people. Bingley's not as stupid as that. You're free to like him. And they kind of joke about that. And, Jane and Lizzie also talk about Bingley's sisters, which is another big thing. Jane says, oh, I really like Bingley's sisters. And Lizzie's like, I don't know. Bingley's sisters are kind of snobbish and rude. And Jane's just like, but they're really nice once you get to know them. And Lizzie's like, are you sure their manners aren't really equal to his? So they kind of had this discussion, and Jane thinks really highly of people. So she's like, I think there's good in everyone, and I think that basically they're a good people. And Lizzie's like, okay, I will defer to your opinion. And they both don't really seem to care about Darcy too much. Darcy doesn't really approach in their conversations that much. And in the last chapter we're covering today, chapter 5, they go to the Lucases, and we meet Charlotte! And Charlotte is Lizzie's best friend, and also very amazing. So the thing about the Lucases is, the husband, Sir William Lucas, was knighted. He was in trade, and he was knighted, and he moved to Hertfordshire. And he likes to throw gatherings and parties, and he's very social. The Lucases are very social. And Charlotte and Lizzie are best friends, and they talk all the time. So they go to the Lucases basically to gossip, and they all gossip about Darcy and Bingley and how they are friends. And basically all of that. And we kind of take a brief little bit of a detour, and we kind of shift over to Darcy and Bingley's perspective. And Bingley's perspective with Jane. And Bingley's perspective with Jane is basically that, his sisters think she's very nice. Darcy doesn't seem to really care about Jane. He just thinks she smiles too much, whatever. And so basically Bingley feels free to like Jane, but they don't think it's anything serious. And when everyone is gossiping about Bingley and Darcy and the whole situation, Miss Bennet is very happy that her daughter stood up twice with Mr. Bingley and danced with him, because that means that Jane has a shot here. So Miss Bennet is pushing very hard for Jane and Bingley to be together, and we actually see this becoming a detriment later on in the book, so pay attention to this. Alright, and that is the end of chapters 1 to 5. This is a little different than what I've done in the past on this channel, so if you like my book coverage or want to see more, I guess let me know in the comments. Have a lovely day, all you valid, wonderful people, and I hope everything goes well for you in life. Stay safe.